And it was just astounding to me. Like, how did I get through this education where I had to think about very esoteric things and not think about this very glaring piece of information? I read Eating Animals, and I immediately called up my mother and I said, read this. This will mess you up. I teach this food politics course now, and so many of them say afterwards, like, this was so eye-opening. I was like really blown away by this. It took a couple weeks really digging into it, fully challenging it, for a lot of them to come to the conclusion that, yeah, this is wrong and something I don't want to participate in. Just being the example, establishing trust, and then letting people ask questions and be curious is the best way to have influence. We don't really have to convince people to be compassionate. We just have to get them to recognize how their behavior might be misaligned with their deeper principles.
Good morning, Jesse. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Well, we've swapped a few messages, and it's brilliant to find out that you and Monica, your colleague at New Roots, are both subscribers and listeners. So you know what you're getting into in this series of conversations, but it's great to have you join me on the other side of the microphone as a guest. So you know, I guess, what you're getting into here. This is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions, and ones that most of humanity still gets wrong. And in common sense terms, I ask the first one with the question of what's real, as a way of thinking about how the deep questions of how we understand reality and how we go about working out what's true and what isn't. But just as important are the questions of ethics and the questions of what matters and who matters and the implications for how we should lead our lives. And I have an obvious bias that you'll be aware of, because I'm trying to popularize and develop Sentientism as this really broad worldview, which is very basic, but I also think quite radical in its implications. And then I summarize it as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So on the what's real question, it doesn't tell us what to believe, but it says that let's at least take a humble, honest approach to using evidence, reason, information about reality to try and understand it. And on the ethical question, again, it's pretty pluralistic, but it says that at least every sentient being, any being that can feel, that can experience, that has its own perspective, that has its own values, should matter seriously in our moral consideration. And I guess that's where some of the radical implications flow from. But I'm talking these conversations to a dazzling variety of different minds, some of whom agree with that worldview and some of whom don't. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey and how you think about those things now and how that underpins the work you do today too. So, but before we get into the big philosophical questions, how would you best introduce yourself to people who haven't come across you already?
I'm the managing director at New Roots Institute, which at one point was called Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, but we changed our name a year ago strategically. And then I do also teach. I've been a teacher for years. I still teach a class at UCLA in food politics, which is essentially an ethics class. But my background is actually in literature and philosophy, or continental philosophy, not really analytic philosophy.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Yeah. Well, let's dive straight into some philosophy. So, as I said, the way I asked this first question, what's real, is actually a bit more focused on epistemology these days, but it can lead into ontology too, because I guess the toolkit we use for thinking about reality leads us to some conclusions about the nature of reality. But a good way into the topic for many of my guests is to understand their journey with respect to religion and the supernatural, and whether they grew up in a family or a culture that was quite spiritual or supernatural or religious in some sense, or one that was maybe more agnostic, atheistic, maybe naturalistic, scientifically minded, or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking has changed and shifted over their life course, if it has actually changed. So I don't know if that's a good way into the topic of how you think about the big questions of the nature of the universe and how best to understand it.
Yeah, I definitely think it's related to how I think. I started out in a Jewish preschool and was taught some of the basics of Judaism, assumed there was a God because that's what the adults told me. And then I think when I was about 6 or 7, I was questioning for some reason whether that was the case. It seemed slightly improbable to me because there was no other evidence for it.
That's pretty early at 6 or 7 to be starting to ask those questions. But
at around 4 or 5, I started getting really concerned about death. and what was going to happen when I died, and the annihilation of my consciousness. And I had pretty deep fears around that. So
wow.
I think that the idea of God was tied in there and would matter to what happened after I died. And it just seemed like there was nothing there. And then I asked my dad, and he said, no, of course there's no God. And so I had this very
and what was your response to that? Because were you nervous asking the question? Did you feel some sort of pressure, or
no, I felt validated, actually. And perhaps I'd sensed it and knew that he was going to give me some kind of answer like that, but I wasn't sure. I remember, I was really young, but I don't remember feeling surprised, but I remember hearing that confirmation and thinking to myself, okay, my dad must be right. Then there is no God. That makes sense. For the next probably 15 years, had a very atheistic worldview, probably some contempt for religion, and people believed in something that just seemed completely impossible to me. And
before you move on from that stage, what did that transition feel like for you, and how did you experience it with friends, family, others at school, and so on? Was it like a big revelation and ripples flowed out and it had ramifications, or was it a sort of quiet internal thing where it wasn't really, a big thing in your life? Or
no, I was pretty loud about it, I think, whenever it came up, because I did, especially in high school, have very, very few atheists around me, if really anybody else. And so one of the first debates in ninth grade we had was, is there a God? And it was pretty much me against the class. And
wow.
There was another kid who was agnostic. It became a point of identity for me, at least like in probably middle school and high school. But some of my points of identity, like being a meat eater, have changed drastically. And around the time I was 20, I had, in college, I was at Berkeley, I had some psychedelic experiences, and it opened me up to the possibility that I might just not be seeing everything that was going on in the world, that my 5 senses were limited, I had a circumscribed intellect, and that I just, it was unlikely I had access to whatever the reality out there is. Yeah, I'm pretty compelled by the argument that, in a lot of ways, like us looking at the universe is kind of like a dog looking at a TV. Like it sees that the TV is there and it's working, but the dog has no idea what's going on with the TV. I barely have any idea what's going on with the TV, and that's only because I've been told I could never make a TV. I get on a plane, it flies. I know about the Bernoulli principle, but I really have no idea how it's swimming through air.
Yeah, fascinating. And I guess there's a few routes people can take, and for some people the trigger is psychedelics, or it might be meditation experiences, or something else. And for some, in a more classically religious mode, it can be a sort of revelatory experience where there's something they personally experience that shifts things in a deep way. And it feels to me, partly from these conversations, there's a few different paths people can take. One is, if you like, quite full on mystical, to a point of thinking, right, reality is radically different from the way I'd understood it before. And now I have seen something that is out there and real and, radically different from thought of it before. There's another route, which is probably where I'd end up on, although I haven't had many of those experiences, which is like the really boring naturalist approach, which is saying, yes, that was a mind-blowing experience, but it's taught me more about the plasticity of the human mind and our perception and our cognition, more than it has indicated that the nature of reality might be radically different. But there can also be a middle ground between those two, where it has opened up the possibility in my mind that there are some radically different things about reality that we can't understand through maybe a traditional scientific method. But I still maintain a naturalistic epistemology in that I am committed to trying to have my beliefs and my credences based on evidence and reasoning, but my evidence includes these experiences I've had, which are, of maybe a radically different reality. So I'm still have a naturalistic epistemology, if you like, but it sort of opened up my ontology to thinking maybe there is something transcendent or beyond, or spiritual, or I don't know, something else. I don't know what you think about that menu, or where it's taken you so far.
Well, there are a lot of ways in which Kant doesn't make sense to me. But one thing that has always struck me as obvious is that there are these two layers. There's the layer of phenomenon, what we experience, and then there's something else going on that we just don't really have access to. Maybe some kind of spiritual access to, intuitive access to, but that we can't figure out empirically. And so I'm actually not sure how much it matters what that like fundamental reality is that we can't access. I still have to behave like as though this world is this naturalistic thing that I'm experiencing. I think that the understanding that there is more gives me like humility and more compassion. Just kind of like, I might not believe that fundamentally we have free will, but because it definitely appears that way, and I have to hold myself accountable on that level, that I'm still going to try to hold myself accountable and not say, well, I don't have free will, and so therefore, like, whatever I do, I don't actually have any choice over. Like, I still have to behave with choice. And so I think that probably somewhere closer to that middle you're talking about, although not exactly, where there's stuff that I don't have access to outside of like perhaps my intuition. And then there's what definitely seems like a material, natural world. But I'm also aware that it's the scale I'm seeing it on, right? I'm looking at things at a very particular scale. Like, I've been told that my table, this solid thing in front of me, is actually mostly space. But that's definitely not the way I'm experiencing it. But if I were a totally different scale, I would experience it very differently.
People talk about it being, we're good at, someone's described it as like medium-sized dry goods, right? That we sort of, that's the level we operate at.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the level I'm operating at. I operate as though, the world is naturalistic because I'm not sure how else to operate in it.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's great. And I like the dog watching the TV analogy, because to my mind, a naturalistic understanding of reality has to include an evolutionary understanding of the sorts of animals we are. And that makes it pretty clear to me that we're not some sort of perfect truth-seeking machine, right? But that's not what we evolved to do. We evolved to do some very different stuff. And we just seem to be in this weird position where we've sort of hacked the biology that was evolved, like most biology was, for replication and survival. And we seem to have just hacked it to decide that some other stuff is important and interesting as well. So a lot of our perceptions of reality are bounded by our perception. They're guided by our intuitions, which I think get less reliable as we move further away from our evolutionary context. So if we think about our intuitions of philosophy of mind or the foundation of physics, or not sure our intuitions are necessarily that good, where if is that a tiger in a bush, they might be a bit more reliable. Yeah, so I like that, because it drives a humility, I think, and a sort of recognition that, well, let's not limit ourselves, right? Let's be curious and keep finding out and trying to learn more, and look at what we've learned so far. It's quite amazing for a sort of variety of ape that we've managed to work this stuff out and write all the books behind, on your screen behind you. So yeah, that's great. Let's not limit ourselves, but let's also remember, who and what we are, and that there probably are going to be some limits. And in a way, that's one of the links between this epistemology question and then when we start getting into the ethics. One of the reasons I find it interesting to address both is because I do think there are some risks if we move away from a naturalistic epistemology or an ontology. Like, the classic story is that even well-intentioned, compassionate people can end up doing terrible things if they're just wrong about reality. And I think, broadly speaking, using evidence and reason with lots of humility is probably our best bet at understanding how things actually are. So it doesn't guarantee safety, but It's a more solid ground than something that's fabricated or arbitrary or made up. And I think there's a danger sometimes when people get that sense of the transcendent or there being something beyond, if they go beyond a humility about that and an open-mindedness, which I think is entirely appropriate, like, who knows? All sorts of weird things we know are true, and there could be all sorts of other weird things that could be true. So that open-mindedness, I think, is important and also, I think, pretty ethically safe. The danger is when people use that openness to then start making stuff up to address those places. So instead of saying, I've had a sense of possibilities about the nature of reality that are very different, that have left me radically open-minded, is very different from saying, and there's a race of multidimensional hyper-elves that are now sending me messages about things I should do in the real world, right? Those are radically different stances. Yeah. So thank you for talking me through how you take that, because one of the other resources that have helped me learn a lot about this. I don't know if you come across this Conspirituality podcast.
I haven't.
It's a really interesting listen. I think you might like it because I think you're into yoga as well. Is that one of the other things on your hobbies list?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, but I picked that up from I think it was on your New Roots Institute profile or something. But they're three guys that came out of the sort of, I guess, broadly defined yoga culture. So they became instructors. They were interested in psychedelics. They had sort of broader transcendent experiences. They felt a lot of draw from some of the Dharmic religions and Eastern thinking. Were frustrated by a lot of the Western commercialization and analytic philosophy and those types of things. But each of them had what ended up being quite a problematic journey that actually involved ending up in some sort of cult-like organizations or high control groups, or people selling scams and unproven supplements, and the whole world of grift and misinformation and disinformation and conspiracism and so on, that seemed to be enabled by what started out as open-mindedness to the transcendent, and it ended up in all these dark places. And the reason I find it fascinating is because I remain frustrated because their scope is still, like most things, quite anthropocentric in their concern about these things. But it's a fascinating analysis because they look at all of these problem cases and dig into them and really drive through and working out the themes of what went wrong there, at the same time as holding on to the value that they find in those worldviews and in those perspectives and in those practices. So I found that really useful because it's helped me get my head around how you can avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as some do, and like just sort of deny that whole space, where you can still get the value, but make sure that the right safety mechanisms are in place and you can spot the red flags for where people start to take things in ethically difficult places. But anyway, so that's a bit of an aside, but I think your approach of just it's about humility and open-mindedness doesn't have those risks. The risk is when people start making stuff up to address those spaces. But
so I see a risk in when people start disagreeing about reality.
Yeah.
And in some ways, people need to start disagreeing about reality, like I think with sentientism or veganism, because a lot of people, their reality, like, it's obvious. We have this right. We have this privilege to be eating animals. We should be doing it. And that very much is their reality. And so sometimes people have to disagree with reality to change the reality more universally. But I also do agree that when people start start disrupting that reality, it can be dangerous when it's like so much in conflict with the reality of others that are very invested in things like, fairness, compassion, relationality. It can become very unrelational when there is that disagreement. But I don't know that I necessarily actually have more access to reality, or it's because we're all agreeing on a certain thing that it makes that reality.
Yeah. And that's another interesting distinction in my mind between our realities, our socially constructed realities, our cognitively constructed realities, which in a weird way, what's going on in our heads are a simulation of what we think is probably out there. I do think there is an external reality out there. I think it's highly likely that I'm not a brain in a vat and you're not, an avatar in some sort of simulation, right? But in a way, our brains are creating a simulation, and that is a reality. But I think it's important to retain the distinction between that reality and an external reality that I do think we all share, even though, as you've said, we never get direct access to that external reality. It's always through different lenses and through our internal simulation that we're running. But so I think it's important to remember that distinction so that in a way that I guess that's what epistemology is trying to do, is trying to maintain some sort of vaguely decent quality correspondence between our cognitive realities and what is actually out there. And evolution, I guess, is one reason why they should be correlated, because if we see things that aren't there or we don't see things that are there, we're probably not going to survive very long. But as you were saying earlier on, it only takes us so far, right, in the medium-sized dry goods space. It doesn't necessarily work for some of the more esoteric, deeper stuff too. Well, that's been fascinating. Thank you. And there's a nice segue there into the ethics topic too. So maybe we should come on to that second question of what matters. So again, I'll be interested in your own personal journey. Again, you can go back to, how you were thinking about these things even at 4 or 5 years old, because it seems like you were pretty much a kindergarten philosopher already, but about good and bad and right and wrong. And, what do those words even mean? And how has that thinking changed through your life? And where have you got to now about thinking about the real root or the foundation of your ethics? If there is something, if you keep asking, well, why does that matter? Why does that matter? Is there something at the bottom, and what's at the bottom?
The journey was definitely away from the certainty that I had about what was right and wrong and who was right and wrong.
And what was the nature of that certainty you had originally? How would you have described that?
Probably adolescence, mostly just lack of maturity, being able to intellectually dominate most of my friends. And so I had enough rhetorical agility that I could convince myself that because they didn't have a satisfactory answer for me, I was right. And so I think a lot of my childhood, adolescence, when I felt so much certainty, was part of just not being able to fully empathize and see people and listen. Part of it was that, I was clever enough to convince myself that I was right, and to present enough evidence to myself that I actually had some kind of access to truth.
Yeah. So there was a confidence there. But and how would you describe what your ethics were like then? What did you think right and wrong and good and bad were there? What was your confidence about?
So when I was 16, I read Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And pretty influenced by that at the time.
Yeah.
And took this stance of amorality, of being above it in some way.
Yeah.
Not really recognizing that I was just taking on a different form of morality.
Yeah, it's a stance in its own right?
Yeah. And I think that my position became more and more relational and about compassion, mostly because that was my moral intuition. That was the sentiment about what felt right to me. The more that I thought about and studied ethics, the more it seemed to be clear to me that I could, there was a way to argue almost anything. And some of it was convincing to me and some of it wasn't. But I could understand the logic. And I can also understand how any logic I was using could also be wrong. So I would just turn in circles. And at some point, I just recognized that there's a feeling I have, and it's not about reasoning myself into it. There's a fundamental belief. I don't know if it comes from my socialization, from something that is more innate in us, that's somehow, prescribed genetically, but it is what felt in alignment. And so I have moved a little bit more towards just recognizing it as a feeling and spirituality over some solid ethics that is totally a matter of right and wrong. Because those right and wrong do seem to be constructs, and they can be, the logic of them can be constructed on any premise. So if someone agrees with me, for example, that hurting others unnecessarily is wrong for them, then I feel much more confident that we can have a conversation where they might come to the conclusion that harming animals unnecessarily is wrong, that consuming animals might be wrong for them. If someone starts with the premise that it is not wrong to harm others for their pleasure, then I can't really argue with that, right? That's just the premise they're starting from. And I can't say that that's wrong. I mean, it's wrong to me.
Yeah, and it's wrong to the victims, but...
Well, and right, and it's wrong to the victims, but if their premise is that the victim doesn't actually matter, that their perspective is irrelevant, then I'm not going to really be able to logically persuade them of anything. Are you familiar with Sperber and Mercier, their paper on rationality?
No, I don't think I've read that one.
The thesis is that rationality is just a tool of persuasion, which actually makes a lot of sense to me. We use it to persuade others, we use it to persuade ourselves, and that it doesn't have any kind of access to truth or reality. It's just a tool of persuasion that's very useful for us. That makes a lot of sense to me as well. So like I can ask questions, and I do this in my classes where I'll ask questions and persuade them one way or another. I used to teach this class on persuasion, and I would start off the class asking them who chose to be here today, who had free will and chose to be here today. And a bunch of them would raise their hand, and some would be a little suspicious about it. They felt this was going somewhere. And then a series of questions that, got them to say that, they didn't actually have control over their choice because of the infinite regression of circumstances over which they really had no control over. And so, like, where was this free will even coming from? Then I'd say, okay, what happened here? How did everyone decide that you actually didn't have choice? And then we break down, I was asking questions and I got them to like reframe it. And it wasn't that they were necessarily wrong, that they were choosing. It was like, which frame are we using to evaluate this? So with reason too, we can use reason and questioning. I could use that to change people's frame and then change their ideas. But if their premise is just totally different to start with, then that's really difficult to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. And I tend to think of reason in a very, very broad sense. So even, to the extent that I would think that the thinking that non-human animals do, even outside of a social context or a persuasion context, still is a type of reasoning, recurring patterns, unlimited associative learning, those types of things count. So I'd probably suggest that there are some types of reasoning that, are outside of a persuasion or a social context. But I think that story that, our capacity to rationalize is largely driven because of the social context is I think very powerful, and it should also give us some pause for thought about how useful that rationality really is in sort of a perfect attribution of the truth, which links back to what we were saying before. And with the ethical journey, the sense that you've come to this sense that I guess the root, the core is about feeling and compassion and relationality, I think is fascinating. And I've come to be quite drawn to that approach too. And I get a sense, because I'm only very much an amateur philosopher, as well, I read and talk to a lot of it, but I wouldn't count myself as a proper philosopher itself. I don't think I could ever write one of those papers. But I do get this sense that quite a lot of moral philosophy, the formalizing of these things, particularly in the analytic tradition, whether it's, rights or deontology or utilitarianism and consequentialism or, conceptions of justice and so on, lots of that stuff, sometimes feels like it's trying to, it might be driven by a sort of faux macho fear of sentimentality. So there's this sense, I think, I'm probably overreading it, but there's this sense that just, feeling just isn't valid in some way. So we need to come up with some superstructure, some rational superstructure to justify our ethics. And in response to that, things like a feminist care ethic are sort of going back to the fact that, well, no, caring about others is good, right? And it's the foundation. And it's interesting because I think even when you drill under, if you talk to a consequentialist or a utilitarian or a deontologist or a virtue ethicist, and you dig down and like, well, why is the virtue of charity a good virtue? Or why is the utility, linked to the well-being of another an important thing? Underneath it all, it is pretty much because those people just care about others. And that is an act of, there's why should there be any shame in it? I think that is at the root of it. And that also gives me some hope that whatever ethical system you tend to prefer, and Sentientism is very open-minded about that. It says, look, sort of use any of those systems you like or a mix of them, that there is space for real consensus around some of the core stuff. And I think the example you gave of, is it wrong to needlessly harm others? Isn't that a consensus that we can pretty much all agree on, whether we're a rights theorist or a utilitarian or X, Y, and Z? So I think there is some common ground there, partly because, underlying it all is just a sort of care that we shouldn't be ashamed of. So,
yeah, there definitely is overlap. When I think about why I have a certain feeling, I do think my feeling points me to some underlying belief that is manifesting that feeling.
Yeah.
So sometimes that belief is conscious. A lot of times I think it's subconscious, programmed in more. Again, I'm not sure where it's programmed in, whether it's completely socialized or, completely innate or whatever.
Yeah.
But I do think that if we can recognize that the foundation for all of this is actually just belief.
Yeah, that feels right to me. And I think the other challenge you touched on, which many people struggle with, is maybe it's because it is a sort of hangover from religious modes of thinking, which do insist that for morality to be grounded, you sort of need this perfect, objective, external force that defines the morality and lays it out for you. And there's a fear that, if you think there is no God or there's no supernatural, so you lose that external, objective, apparently perfect force that drives your morality, then there is no morality and the whole thing falls apart. So obviously people with a religious worldview sometimes think that, and that makes them worry that, if the world turns to atheism or secularism, then, we'll lose any moral foundations and civilization will be destroyed, right? So that you can understand them having that worry because they still have that worldview that God defines what's good, and without that God, there is no good or bad. But I find that pattern of thinking in many people who've moved away from a religious worldview. So they've moved away from a religious worldview. They say, well, I have a naturalistic understanding of the world and the world around us. We're evolved beings and so on. But there's still something in their head that insists that for morality to be meaningful, you have to have some perfect, objective, external standard. And then they desperately struggle when they can't find it. And I'm like, well, why are you struggling, right? Who said that morality had to be grounded by some perfect, objective, external being in the first place, right? It can just be a choice. It can just be a feeling. It can be, so it's almost like we've queued up this problem for ourselves that didn't really need to be a problem in the first place. And we can just find a different, maybe more intuitive path forward, which it feels like that's sort of where you've got to. Is you've turned away from a nihilism which denies all of morality. But you've also recognized that you don't really need a sort of perfect external justification for things. It can be about feeling and relationality, and that can be grounded in a belief that we exist and others exist, and we can choose to care about each other's feelings.
Yeah, but I think that it's not even really a choice. It's just I can't function without employing some kind of morality, without having some kind of moral beliefs, even if I'm then believing that my beliefs are like not moral or above morality. Like, we're constructed in a way that it's just impossible to escape. And so just understanding that it's going to have to be grounded in something because we can't escape it, makes us choose like what that morality is. And then we can decide that we can believe that it's grounded in something external somewhere because it seems like it has to be in order to like be real for us, because that's what we've been told we have to believe in order to justify it. because otherwise, like, it's not persuasive to other people. And if it's not persuasive to other people, then it's destabilizing for us. So we still have to stabilize it socially for ourselves. Like, I had all the self-talk. I realized at some point, like, if I get in an argument with someone, I'm having all these thoughts about why they're wrong. Really, I'm just trying to convince myself. Like, it's not like it's not even really about convincing them. It's like me telling myself what I want to believe. And they just become a foil for this process. So whether I'm saying it aloud or whether I'm, formulating the arguments in my head, I recognize that, it's all just like me trying to reinforce a certain worldview that I want to be the fact.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah. And there's another source of humility, I guess, isn't it? When you're in those discussions. Yeah. Well, let's come on to the second part of this ethical question, which I'm so frustrated that it's neglected in most of moral philosophy. So I've got this is just one of many examples. But I've got a book downstairs by a chap called David Wiggins, who's a deeply respected philosopher who's written an entire book about ethics, and it's like 600 pages long, and the word animal doesn't even appear in it. Right? It's just the assumption that only humans matter in our moral consideration is just so deep and runs through culture in such powerful, unthinking ways. It's just a deep frustration. So that's why I bang on about it all the time. And in a way, that's why Sentientism focuses on moral scope and is less worried about, which moral system you might then apply. So I'm interested in your journey on this front as well, because I think many people could listen to what you've talked about in terms of this journey from nihilism and thinking about different ways of thinking and a sense of feeling and compassion, but could easily have restricted that whole conversation to just talking about humans, and they would have just signed off and said, yeah, I agree, I'm with Jesse on all of that stuff. So what was your journey of thinking about moral scope? And again, you can go back to your sort of kindergarten philosopher days if you like, and that can both be within humanity, because often there's a journey there about family and friends, and then maybe broadening to think about other humans that are very different from you or very distant from you. But I'm also obviously critically interested in the question about the more than human, and when did you start to think about non-humans seriously as an ethical topic, and what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, it's a little embarrassing that it wasn't until my mid to late 20s that I really started thinking about it. And it's a major reason, or it's a primary driver of why I do the work I do now with high school and college students, is because I had what was supposed to be a pretty stellar education. I went to these institutions where there are all of these smart people. I took philosophy courses in these institutions, and the information about what was happening with animals, how we were treating them, and how we might challenge our thinking around that treatment just was not really ever brought up. And it was just astounding to me, like, how did I get through this education where I had to think about very esoteric things and not think about this very glaring piece of information? And I definitely think that there's more knowledge about it now. Like, I didn't hear the word vegan until I was in college. And then there was someone that I was attracted to, and I found out she was vegan. And I thought, that's weird. And that was even the first time I heard it. Now, when we go into classrooms, pretty much anywhere, you say vegan, everyone knows what vegan means. Like, knows someone who's vegan or they're vegan. So there is a lot more awareness of it. And I do see that shift.
And do you remember what the initial the first time it was mentioned for you? And
yeah, that was the first time it was mentioned. I didn't know a single vegetarian in high school. If someone I had a vegetarian friend in college, and later on I asked him, why didn't you ever push me on the ideas? Like, why didn't you ever challenge the way I was thinking? And he said, oh, well, everyone's on their own journey. So, well, yeah, but you can expedite the journey a little bit.
Yeah.
I would have appreciated it so that I didn't just, continue in my ignorance or just lack of having to think about it. So there was just no one around me that was pushing me on the thinking. And I teach this food politics course now, and we spend a couple weeks on the intersection of race, gender, and species in the food system. And I end that unit with showing them Dominion, and that's after they've read about things like, carnism, they've read some ecofeminism, they've read a little bit of utilitarian and deontological philosophy. I give them an essay by AFCO, just
brilliant, yeah.
And so many of them say afterwards, like, this was so eye-opening. I was like really blown away by this. And these are a bunch of UCLA students, even today. They all know what a vegan is. They know someone who's vegan, but it took a couple weeks, or sometimes a little bit more, of really digging into it, fully challenging it, for a lot of them to come to the conclusion that, yeah, this is wrong and something I don't want to participate in. And it's about 70 students in this course, so it's a decent sample of students at UCLA anyway, which is a particular demographic. And I have them at the beginning of the course answer 6 questions, one of which is, how do you think about animals and the food system? And then at the end, they have to re-answer all those questions. And I always read through those with interest to see how people change. And a lot of them do say, I was shocked. I don't think this is justifiable. Some of them say, I don't think it's justifiable, but I still I'm reducing. I do continue to do it. And then there are others that after all of these arguments and in class, I run it as a seminar. I run it with questions. I don't lecture. I give them the information to read, and then they're talking about it, and I'm making them think critically about it and respond. A number of them still say, yeah, they shouldn't be in these CAFOs. That's definitely wrong. I care about the suffering, but I still, but I do think it's okay to eat them. And that's after really thinking it through, and seeing how other people in class are responding. And I find that fascinating, because I do think that morality is in most cases socially reasoned. For most people, in most cases,
it's much more about fitting in than it is being right in some deeper sense.
Yeah, which is why I don't think that it's as long as sentientism or veganism isn't the normative stance, you're probably not going to exceed 10% of the population that's moralistic enough to go against the grain, and 10% might even be high. You need to change the social pressures. You need to get everyone thinking that everyone else thinks that this is wrong. And I'm going to be judged for behaving in this way. I'm going to be judged for consuming animals or talking about them in a speciesist way. And I think it's that fear of judgment that will end up shifting the morality much more than any kind of individual inception.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And what did that journey feel like for you? Because I think part of your point here is that, you and me and most of my guests, not all of them, have gone on this journey with us yet, although hopefully our conversation nudged some of them further that direction. But we're a bit unusual, right? We're quite weird, because however long it took, and for me it took decades, and of course the journey's never completely over either, because veganism isn't some sort of pure, perfect, ethical end state, right? There's always harms we're causing that we could reduce further. But however long that journey took, we did go on it despite the social norms and the social context, whereas most people, as you say, it is much more about fitting in and, lining up with the social norms than really being willing to break them. So what, for you personally, what did that journey feel like? What was the social context like? What was the psychological context like? What are, friends, family, and those around you think as you went through those steps?
Yeah. So I read Eating Animals, and I immediately called up my mother and I said, read this. This will mess you up. So my family actually ended up being pretty amenable, which has made things a lot easier. For me, I definitely had some friends who were more amenable, some who were resistant. I was very frustrated and angry about it, as many people are when they feel like they now see this thing that seems so obvious, and how do these people around them not see it? So that was definitely frustrating for me. And I had to actually, part of why I've spent a number of years focusing on communication and how to effectively communicate and build receptivity in myself to cultivate receptivity in others, because I recognized that my frustration and anger was not persuasive at all. In fact, if anything, it was the opposite. It was making people defensive. And so, how could I be more persuasive? And that actually, in the end, was trying not to be so persuasive, but focusing on building the relationship and the trust, and letting that trust be a channel for communication that if the other person was open, could influence them, rather than, ignoring their relationship first and the trust first, and going straight for trying to get someone to see how wrong they were about what they were doing. So that was a big part of my journey, and learning how to really listen to people. Most of my job, whether it's in the classroom or, managing the organization, is asking questions. So this is actually it's a fun format for me, but normally I'm asking questions and trying to get other people to see things from different perspectives, or just trying to understand more about where they're coming from and how they're seeing things. And in the end, I do think that just like being the example on a personal level, just being the example, establishing trust, and then letting people ask questions and be curious, and then my not applying pressure, is the best way to have influence. I think on a social level, what New Roots works on is not only having the conversations with people, with lots and lots of students in classrooms, but then having some students we train to be effective communicators and campaigners to change things structurally, because the environment matters so much, like how people are interacting with the environment, what the environment is telling them or allowing for. So, that there are suddenly like vegan options, and then that becomes a conversation, that defaults are changed, right? That they're seeing more people at their school be aware about the impacts of factory farming on animals, on the environment that they, care about, on public health, and on the workers and the system, who many are kind of shocked when they think about how people are affected by having to slaughter hundreds or thousands of animals. It's those gradual feedback loops between the changes in the environment and the changes in like behavior and understanding that I think, at least we're working on that in schools, to see how those social norms then change over time, because we're working on both the behavioral and the structural levels. To me, at this point, like that's the most persuasive way to do it. And we're gathering a bunch of data on it and, seeing how it goes. But I'm not sure of a better way to do it than having someone's attention for an hour, asking them questions, getting them to say that, they believe that, animals shouldn't be hurt, or that this system is messed up, that they don't really want to participate in it. And then having others work on making those changes that they profess that they want to make more possible, and everyone else seeing that, right?
Yeah. That feedback loop that just keeps around and around and around. Yeah, thank you. Well, you've started to beautifully answer the final question of how do we make a better world. So that's a really good insight into, I guess, your sort of theory of change and how we drive it forward. And I guess sometimes I start this question by asking, okay, do you have some sort of grand utopian vision? And that can be as broad as you like. That could be every challenge we're facing, intrahuman ethics, as well as the challenges of animal agriculture and food and so on. So yeah, I should leave that question there, right? But you can either answer, do you have a sort of grand utopian vision writ large for where humanity and sentientity could go? Or if you prefer, what's your utopian vision for the world you focus on, which is the food and agricultural systems. And, if you could wave a magic wand, what would that look like in a future state?
The way we treat animals, the way we treat humans, the food system, they're all very connected. So I don't see the possibility of really influencing one without influencing the others.
So even if you're focusing on one particular area, you have to recognize the interconnectedness of the other stuff that's going on. Yeah.
So when we are training our fellows or when we're training staff, like we want to focus on the fact that it's in our values, in our DNA, as we call it. We have these 5 strands, and one of them is humble self-awareness. And we recognize we don't have all the answers. And so we practice curiosity. We listen to others to grow as individuals and as an organization. And I think the movement as a whole could use a significant amount of uncertainty and humility in how we, in what we believe and then how we're approaching things. I think that if you start with that basis, that you don't know, that we're going to be curious, that we're going to listen to others, and that we're going to, another value we have is inclusive collaboration, which is about striving to see beyond your ego, to meet others where they're at, to increase impact. Combining those things is a way to, I think, increase compassion in general. Definitely for animals, for nature, just like increasing reverence. If we're, because I in one of the podcasts you did, it came up about how we think we're the pinnacle of evolution. I actually look at trees and think that trees are definitely much more advanced than we are. They can feed themselves. They live a lot longer. They're magnificent. They communicate with each other. And so having that kind of openness generally, I think, makes us much more reverent and respectful of all existence, which should have an effect on the food system, which should have an effect on how we treat each other, on how we treat other animals.
And does that humility and that uncertainty that runs through those values mean that you're wary of being too clear about some sort of utopian future state? Is it more about values and exploration and curiosity, and we'll work out where we need to go, rather than saying, here's the answer, here's a transition plan, and now we march forward?
For me, it's very much about the process. Of course, as an organization, we have a vision. We map out that vision. We figure out how we're going to get there. We adapt as we go along because, of course, we learn things about how to fare better that we didn't know everything beforehand, which is just built in. And so for me, it very much is about this process, and through this process being an example of how we make these changes. And we just happen to focus on factory farming because, it's a huge locus of suffering. It's also how we get into classrooms, right? If we were to focus on animal agriculture in general, that's much more limiting. So who we have access to, who's going to listen to us, but pretty much everyone can agree that factory farming's messed up. So we can work on instilling these values, or at least getting people to consider these values that are going to, I think, make for this more compassionate world by focusing on factory farming.
As a way in, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not that we only care about factory farming, but it is our access point.
Yeah. And to focus on some of the most egregious and largest scale problems as a way in makes sense, partly because, as you said, Sentience Institute has done some interesting surveys in the US of, I think sample size was of a couple of thousand people, so it's significant. And the numbers they were getting were, I think 47% or 52%, depending on which sort of questions you ask about, should factory farming be banned? I mean, there were quite higher numbers for should slaughterhouses be illegal, right? And it leads you to think, well, had people really thought this through? But still, I think you're absolutely right. There is a sort of, latent thing in the discourse that factory farming is bad, even though nearly everyone continues to buy from it on a day-to-day basis. And one of the challenges or worries people have about a focus on factory farming is that there can be an implication that if we're focusing on factory farming as being ethically problematic, then of course there is another type of animal agriculture that is humane and sustainable and so on and so forth. And how do you address that sort of challenge in your work? Because my understanding of your values and your work isn't your idea isn't to switch from factory farming to sustainable, humane animal agriculture. It is based on a much more foundational value of animals and ending in their exploitation.
We avoid prescriptions, but people do bring it up and are looking for another way of continuing to eat animals. And we don't say don't eat animals, you shouldn't eat animals, because we don't think that's effective. So what we do instead, if a student brings up, well, where can I get eggs that are more humane? Say, okay, well, it really depends on what your ethics are and where you fall. But here's some questions you might want to ask yourself. At the most ethical farms, the male chicks are still killed because they're not useful. So you have to ask yourself how you feel about that. The hens are killed after their egg production drops because it's not economically viable to keep them around, no matter how good the intentions of the farm is. So you have to ask yourself how you feel about that. So approaching it in that way, get them to connect their values to what they're doing rather than telling them this is bad, we're against this. We don't have to say we're against this because they're probably going to be against it.
Yeah. And is part of that also asking people, okay, what do you think the word humane means? Because I think a lot of people seem to have forgotten that. Whereas when you go back and look in the dictionary, it's about treating someone with kindness and compassion, which again doesn't mean torturing them a bit less before you kill them so you could sell their body, right? So but I really like that approach of allowing the individual to, with support from your question and guidance, to find their own way through these things in terms of the likelihood of them, really grokking it, thinking these things through and making a change that will stick. That feels much more compelling. Yeah, thank you.
As soon as we tell them what we think that they should do, they're going to we're going to be creating resistance in them.
Yeah, the instinct is to look for reasons why not, and to yeah. No, that's great. Thank you. And it's clear that you see the role of education as being really important. And as you described, part of your work at New Roots is, as you said, going out in the classroom so that people don't go through the experience that you and I had of waking up to this stuff in our 20s or 30s and 40s, right? It's something that's absolutely central to our culture and our thinking and even the most rudimentary ethics, right? We should be learning about this stuff from scratch. So that's one obviously powerful intervention. And then your leadership programs are more about empowering people to drive the systemic changes as well. And I love the idea of education generally as a lever to pull on, partly because I do think it can be very deeply effective. And in a way, that's partly why I work on a worldview in the first place, is because I think that humans are extremely powerful for good and ill. Almost every human decision, whether we know it or not, is based on our worldview. So, it seems like a robust, quite deep intervention that could have lots of positive benefits if we could, help individual humans and institutions find their way to adopting a, better, more compassionate and better grounded worldview. So I guess that's why I focus on worldviews as an idea. I do think, and I hope it's effective. It probably also partly is driven by some sort of utopian thinking in my mind about wanting to believe that every human, has the capacity to be, broadly defined, rational and compassionate and caring, and that a lot of our educational systems seem to be starting from, we're very young children. I think they have a broadly naturalistic worldview, right? They're looking around, they're curious, they're trying to understand what's going on. And then later on, adults tell them fabrications. And not only do we tell them fabrications and dogmas, we also tell them, you should believe this unquestionably, you should follow that, you should do this. We tell them a toolkit that undermines their own critical thinking and their own epistemology. And on the ethical side, again, I think most young children, the classic example of, put a young child with a pig and a carrot, they'll eat one and cuddle the other, right? So And then our educational system and social norms and so on sort of take us away from that and teach us that certain things are normal and acceptable, which, you and I have come to see just are not. So in a way, in the education system, it feels as much to me sometimes about, if only we could step away from doing the bad education, that's as much of a problem as it is about a sort of a good education that helps young people find their way to, in a way where they already are, right, which is compassionate and open-minded and, and reasonably critical thinking young people. And I should come up with a question instead of just rambling. But that's partly why I see education as such an important place. But at the same time, it does come with its challenges because there's so much inertia in the educational system. It's a place where our cultural values are stuck pretty hard. It is quite hard to drive change through those educational systems, which is why initiatives like yours, where you're sort of coming in from the outside, using something like factory farming as a way in, as something you can inject on top of the system to say, look, at least let's give you some classes that might, help you see things in a different way. That's quite a powerful way in. But there are challenges to it as well. And a couple of things that I come across in my own sort of amateurish work, where I'm trying to engage more in the educational space in the UK around sentientism and some of these related ideas and other worldviews. We're dealing with some very socially contentious challenges here, about deep-seated beliefs and ethics that, most of us are complicit in. And those things, particularly around animal agriculture, are bound up with people's values and their identities and even their sense of what it is to be a man or to be an American or to be, whatever it is, right? These are deep-seated things. How do we manage the risk that we're putting kids on the front line of those really difficult social change issues while respecting those kids enough to want to help them find their way honestly through those issues? How do you think about that sort of challenge? And I guess a way of crystallizing that is, and I don't know what age ranges you cover, but I do workshops with kids that are 5 years old, right? And I discussed it with teachers, and I'm reasonably open with the kids about it as well. But I can imagine some of the conversations that happen at dinner there, and these are young kids, and starting sometimes very difficult conversations with parents that may really not want to hear it. So.
And I actually wonder how much that could backfire with the young kids, because they go home and then they're getting an avalanche of pressure because it's been introduced at that point, and then the parents have to snuff it out. We don't work with younger kids. We work with high school and college students because, for a few reasons. One, they have more choice over what they're consuming, particularly college students, but also they can run campaigns in their schools. So they can actually make changes that, it's very unlikely that elementary school kids or middle school kids will be able to make. So yeah, I definitely see some of the issues with the younger kids. And I understand the idea that it's great to get to them younger before some of their ideas have crystallized. But I actually don't know that their ideas are so crystallized by high school or college that they can't be led towards, caring about animals or factory farming. In fact, I think that's the time when it could possibly make the most sense to them, and they're most likely to rebel against their parents and social norms, rather than when they're younger. They're going to be less likely to rebel against those. So yeah, I can see arguments in different ways. Like, our strategy though is focused on high school and college students.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's really useful. That's good. I think it's good counsel and good advice as well, as to be careful about that. There's a group that I've, in the UK at least, that are very used to dealing with exactly that type of issue, which is religious education teachers. And that field is shifting in really interesting ways because it had a very traditional history, and there's still quite a lot of, Christianity is the right one, and that's the default, and that's what you should spend most of your time on. That's still quite, common in what happens around the country, and it's still a legal requirement in terms of both lessons, but also, there's supposed to be a active, broadly Christian worship every day, right? Which most schools ignore. Anyway, but that field of religious education is shifting and changing, and there's some really progressive thinkers in there that are genuinely interested, not just in here's the right religion, right? But they're interested in pluralism and helping kids understand different points of view and live in a multicultural and multi-religious society that are interested in kids developing critical thinking skills so they can think about their own worldview and others, and also then navigate their own way and take their own choices. And obviously I love all of that stuff, right? Because those ideas are sort of central to a sentientist way of thinking anyway. So it fits in really neatly. But it does mean that those RE teachers are having to cope with some of these very same risks because they're working with kids that are, all age ranges from, 5 all the way through, some of whom are coming from a family and a context which is absolutely determined to insist that our religion is the one true faith and is absolutely essential to our family and our culture and our identity. And questioning it is not just dangerous, it's actually wrong and maybe even evil. Right? So if you're a young child who's been brought up in that context, and not all of them are, of course, many of them already come from quite a pluralistic, open, progressive mindset, but then you're into an RE class where people are telling you, well, there are some people who don't even believe in God at all, right? That's another interesting area where you're taking a very socially contentious, challenging topic, and you've got, frankly, some, really brilliant teachers working out how to sensitively navigate that. And I think that is the balance, respecting the kids enough to want to not sugarcoat stuff, not avoid topics, want to help them find their own way, but at the same time realizing that, they're on the front lines of some of this stuff, right? So it's an interesting parallel there with, with the religion topic and with the, the animal ethics and the veganism topic.
Yeah. And that's another reason why our approach is not prescriptive, even though we have a clear agenda. Like, we do want to end factory farming, but we know that the way to do that is not to prescribe, but we think it's to make people aware, to get them to think, and also to get them not just to hear the information, but to speak these things aloud, especially in front of other people. Because that's when it matters, when they're hearing each other say these things, when they're hearing themselves say it. Because if you just give them the information and you don't make them say it, they're going to process it through all of their desirability biases and confirmation biases. And you're not going to actually get them to think critically by just giving them the information. But at the same time, we are very much like trying to practice curiosity and focus on just getting them to think about it rather than convincing them of it, because that's going to undermine the trust.
Yeah. And I think that was also, one of the second challenge I was going to frame, but I think you've answered it already, which is how do you get the balance right between, entering into this education space with integrity and with your own values and being open about that, and that not becoming a form of sort of indoctrination or where you're imposing. And I think you've answered that beautifully, where it is about, of course, we do have an agenda and there are perspectives that we think are valid and they're very well founded too. And there's, we shouldn't be ashamed of or hide that. But the pedagogy is very much about, the kids and the young people, or even the leaders in your leadership course, exploring, asking questions, navigating, discussing that amongst themselves and finding their own way through that stuff. I think that's in a way, that's a sort of compassionate ethic implied into education anyway, which is it's about the people being educated, right? It's less about teaching and more about learning and more about their discovery and the path they want to follow that's being enabled, rather than it being, here's a long list of facts that we're going to cram into your brain for a brutal test at the end of the semester.
Yeah. And we, along with that approach, we also emphasize with our educators that we're not going in there with the truth. You're not going in there preaching the truth. This is a vision of the world that we happen to think is more beautiful, that, is the way we would like to see it. But understanding that that's actually just what's going on. We want to see the world this way. And we're not going in there with with righteousness. This is what is more true than anything else that's going on. And I think that mentality, that mindset when we're approaching people is also really important, because it's very easy for vegans to be, for people, but vegans to be dogmatic.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it goes back to the identity thing that you and I have talked about a few times before, where one classic self-defense mechanism when you're challenged by these topics is to revert to the identity thing and say, well, oh, they are vegans. I am not a vegan. And it's another line of self-defense. And I even see that in practical decisions, where I was behind someone in a queue for some food, choosing different menu options, and it was late in the day and they'd run out. There wasn't much left, and there was a hummus salad or something. And the woman in front of me was like, "Oh, that looks delicious. What's in it?" And the guy behind the counter said, to explain what it was, and said, "Oh, it's completely vegan." And the woman just turned around and walked away. Right. So she was like, "That looks delicious. It sounds delicious. The ingredients sound delicious, but that is a vegan food, and I am not a vegan. Therefore, and off I go." I mean, mind blowing, right? Absolutely mind blowing. If he hadn't said that, she would have picked it up and paid, £5 for it. So
Right.
there's something about that, again, it echoes what you were saying. In the classroom or with young children having the difficult conversation over dinner is you want to address the topic, but at the same time, you don't want to trigger a defensiveness or another line of defense that it's more productive and more effective to help the individual find their way through those things. And yeah, thank you. So the other thing that I think it would be interesting to touch on is a bit more of the practicalities about new routes, because one of the difficulties is scaling these ideas, right? I was in some classrooms yesterday, a very different context. So in a way, your entry point is factory farming. My entry point for Sentientism is learning about different worldviews. And I talk about other worldviews as well. So it's a very different approach. But going into one classroom is great, right? And it's an enormous buzz. It's a privilege to be in there and to, I like to think I use a lot of the approaches you do as well. It's about exploration and curiosity and learning and finding your own path. It's not about here's the answer and this is why you must agree with me. So that's great fun. But how do we scale it? And New Routes has already achieved quite a lot of scale. So I don't know if you wanted to tell a little bit of story about, number of classes, number of people you've reached, the Leadership Academy scale, and where do you think that can go? And as part of that future story, obviously it will be great if New Routes can do more and more and more in this sort of injecting idea. Do you see that there's a possibility that we could actually shift the educational systems themselves? Can you imagine a future where, the American or the UK or even global educational systems have these approaches and values embedded into them so that we're not having to inject stuff from the outside?
Yeah. Well, I think as you gradually shift the perspective of communities, like that will have an impact on how they're thinking, how they're teaching. We get into classrooms and we have this hour or 2 hours with tens of thousands of students each year. So we over the course of years, we've done this with hundreds of thousands of students. And that's the step one, right? Step two is the recruitment and making sure that all these students are aware that we have this leadership program, this fellowship that they can participate in. And so we want to then be pulling students from those schools and building these advocacy ecosystems. So building community there where there is support, where they can be working together, because a lot of times they just don't know who to work with. They don't have any support. They don't know where to go. They might be the lone vegan, or, there's some other, there's that might be, but they might not be into advocacy. We're helping build these communities in these different places we're in, like New York, LA, San Diego, Ohio, Michigan, etc. And then these students get trained. There's an intensive summer course, which is actually about to start in a couple weeks. There, we have between 100 and 150 students in that. And then that is 8 weeks in summer. Then they have the academic year where they're working on their campaigns. We partner with other organizations to work on campaigns. And sometimes in a lot of cases, these are cutting the oat milk surcharge, or making oat milk the default, or getting more vegan options on the menu. Some of our students at UCLA have done some really good stuff with being part of getting UCLA to go 50% plant-based in their dining halls by, I think, 2027, or getting the entire Model UN this last year to go completely plant-based. So they're doing that kind of work. And then that's working on changing the social norms on those campuses, particularly again, like UCLA is a big campus, so that's going to be harder. But in some of the smaller campuses or high schools where we're speaking to lots and lots of the students every year, and then there are students working on these changes, I think we've seen in our data that the percentage of students identifying as vegan and vegetarian increases over the course of years. And those are just like random samples from that school. It's not even necessarily the same students. So there does seem to be social influence there. And as we gather more and more data, we'll be able to evaluate that more clearly. That then is all in service of providing the movement and factory farming with the trained and vetted talent. We also are invested in connecting more to the environmental movement. And that's why we rebranded New Roots Institute. So we want to be bridging with the environmental movement to get our students involved there. And a lot of them are already, and they are interested. So it's natural. It's not like we're trying to force anyone into anything that they're not already interested in doing. But the environmental movement still is not really recognizing factory farming as a major driver of climate change and other environmental degradation in the way that we think it definitely should be.
Yeah, there are cracks in the taboo, but the taboo is still pretty strong. I mean, the number of conversations which are totally dominated by the energy problem, which I agree is big, right? But the neglect of animal agriculture in those discussions is an abject failure, epistemologically and ethically. So,
yeah. This is all to like build a stronger movement as well, which is the primary function of New Roots. But in the meantime, we are working on social change in these smaller communities, and there's evidence in it. Or if you're familiar with Damon Santola's research in particular on social change, that it starts in smaller groups and like around the periphery, and then that's how you get the greater social influence. We are ensuring, on this smaller scale that we're working on in, 8 cities and, with 150 students, new students each year, to make sure we're getting the model right or as honed as we can. And then it's very scalable because we can just hire new educators to educate and organize in these different cities doing the same kind of thing. Our educational model is also very scalable. So we just need more staffing capacity for it. But there's nothing that's intrinsically limiting it.
Yeah, no, that's great. It sounds very powerful. Thank you. And is your sense that the progress is going to be reasonably linear and it's just more of the same and scaling in more cities and so on? Or is your sense that, there will be tipping points or points where things really start to shift quickly? What's your sense of that?
My sense is that there will be tipping points. I think that all the research that I'm familiar with, like once you get to a certain point in how many people are professing a particular ideological stance, like the social pressure on everyone else in those groups becomes too much to resist.
As you said before, at the point at which there's social pressure one way, it feels socially risky to come out as a vegan, right? When that starts to shift the other way, I think you're right. Given we're social, again, as you said, we're more social beings than we are moral or truth-seeking. I think that could shift pretty quickly. And partly because, in a way, we're sort of tapping into a latent ethic that I think most people have already, absent the social norms and the normalization and the marketing and the misinformation. Who would want to needlessly cause harm to other sentient beings, right? So we're sort of tapping into that latent underlying compassionate ethic, I think so.
Yeah, which makes it easier because we don't really have to convince people to be compassionate. We just have to get them to recognize how their behavior might be misaligned with their deeper principles.
Yeah. I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah. Well, I should probably let you go. It's been brilliant to talk to you. Thank you so much for spending some quality time with me and exploring your philosophical journey and how that underpins the work of New Roots too. Well, then the final thing is what's the best way of people following you, keeping up to date with your work, supporting New Roots? I don't know how much social media you do personally, but where would you point people? I'll include stuff in the show notes, of course, with the main links.
So my personal social media is very limited, and you can find me on LinkedIn. And I think most relevant here is following New Roots work. I'm definitely accessible there. And I encourage everyone to go to newrootsinstitute.org. And, you can find out more about what we're doing. If it's a, interest to anyone, they're always welcome to reach out directly as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, thank you again, Jesse. It's been great to have you as a guest on Sentientism, and please do stay in touch and say hi to Monica for me too.
I will. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care.